In the grand history of terrible ideas, hiring a human as the imperial bodyguard ranks somewhere between "let's poke that black hole to see what happens" and "these xenomorphs would make excellent pets." At least, that's what the Galactic Court thought, and they made sure to document their disapproval in approximately 47,392 official complaints, each written in triplicate and filed with the appropriate departments. The thing about humans that really got under the various appendages of the court species was their absolute refusal to do things the proper way. The proper way, of course, being whatever method had been used for the last 12 millennia, documented in manuals thicker than a Jovian skull, and approved by no less than 16 different committees. The Emperor, in their infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humour, had chosen this particular human after a series of events that the court desperately tried to classify as highly unfortunate coincidences, rather than proof that humans are actually terrifying. It started when the previous Imperial Guard force, consisting of the finest warriors from 17 species and armed with technology so advanced it made quantum physics look like a child's puzzle, was systematically dismantled by a single human armed with what appeared to be a rubber band, 3 paper clips, and what they insisted was just a really strong cup of coffee. The human didn't even have the decency to use proper combat techniques. They just improvised. The very word made the Chief of Imperial Security's secondary nervous system shut down in protest. Improvisation wasn't in any of the manuals. It wasn't even in the manual about what to do when something wasn't in the manuals. The court's attempts to understand human security methods had been equally frustrating. They'd studied human military history, expecting to find complex battle formations and sophisticated strategic theories. Instead, they found what appeared to be a species whose primary tactical advantage was being too stubborn to realize when they should, by all logical measures, be dead. Take, for example, the incident that had first brought humans to the Empire's attention. A small human merchant vessel, armed with nothing more threatening than a malfunctioning coffee maker, had somehow survived an encounter with a dreaded space leviathan by convincing it that human music was so terrible that the creature fled into the nearest black hole to escape. The official report noted that the humans had called this blast-boosted dubstep, and the mere mention of these words now triggered emergency protocols in most sensitive scanning equipment. The Emperor's new bodyguard approached security with the same chaos that characterized their species. While other guards would scan for weapons using the latest quantum neural phase shift detection systems, the human would just watch. They claimed they could read body language, which the court initially assumed was some form of forbidden telepathy, until they realized it was just humans being unnervingly good at noticing when someone was, in their words, acting sketchy. Most disturbing of all was their insistence on what they called preventative measures. Traditional imperial security focused on responding to threats with overwhelming force. The human, however, prevented threats by being friendly. They knew the names of every service worker in the palace, chatted with the maintenance staff, and somehow managed to create an informal intelligence network based entirely on gossip and shared complaints about the palace's cafeteria food. The court had tried to explain that this was not how things were done. Security protocols were supposed to be rigid, unchanging, and preferably involve at least 3 forms of advanced technology that no one quite understood, but everyone pretended to. The humans' response had been to smile in that unsettling way their species had, and say, sometimes the best security system is just making sure nobody wants to kill you in the first place. This fundamentally human approach to imperial security had left the court in a state of perpetual anxiety. They couldn't fault the results. Attempts on the Emperor's life had dropped to 0. The human had turned the entire concept of imperial security on its head, and the worst part was that it worked better than anything they'd tried before. The court's only consolation was their firm belief that this experiment would surely end in disaster. They just had to wait for the inevitable catastrophic failure that would prove them right. They'd been waiting for 3 years now, and their collective patience was wearing thinner than a space-time membrane at a quantum physics convention. Little did they know they were about to get exactly what they'd been waiting for, just not in the way they expected. But that's the thing about humans. They never do anything quite the way you expect them to. The Galactic Emperor's annual Harmony Ball. It was exactly the sort of event that security personnel had nightmares about. Picture, if you will, a gathering of the galaxy's most important beings, each with enough enemies to populate a small solar system, all crammed into one ornate room, while trying to pretend they weren't plotting each other's downfall over appetizers. The human bodyguard was, as usual, doing everything wrong. Instead of standing stoically behind the Emperor with an appropriately intimidating weapon, they were mingling. The court's collective blood pressure, or equivalent circulatory system measurements, rose every time they watched the human casually chat with servers, joke with diplomats, and somehow managed to diffuse 3 potential interplanetary incidents with nothing more than what they called dad jokes. "This is highly irregular," muttered the chief of protocol, their crystalline form vibrating with disapproval. The Imperial bodyguard should maintain a proper distance of exactly 2.7 meters from the Emperor at all times, as clearly stated in Section 47, subsection 12, paragraph. They were interrupted by the human walking past with a plate of what appeared to be those horrifying Earth snacks called pigs in blankets, offering them to a group of Aropodian ambassadors who, despite their initial reluctance, were soon jittering in what could only be described as culinary delight. The ball was proceeding with its usual mix of barely concealed hostilities and overly elaborate dance numbers when it happened. A delegation from the Proximan Concordat approached the Emperor, their ceremonial robes flowing in precisely the way that the protocol manual said they should. Everything seemed perfectly normal, except to the human, who had suddenly stopped telling their terrible joke about why the photon didn't need a hotel room. What happened next occurred so quickly that the court security recordings had to be slowed down to 1/100th speed to capture it all. The lead Proximan delegate reached into their robes, presumably for the traditional gift of harmony, and the human moved. Now it's important to understand that the Proximan Concordat had evolved from ambush predators. Their species could move faster than most beings could blink. The assassin had planned this moment for months, knowing that even the most advanced security systems had a delay of at least 0.3 seconds. The human moved before the assassin's hand had even cleared their robe. What followed was a masterclass in what the human would later describe as winging it. They didn't use any of the standard counter-assassination techniques. Instead, they threw their plate of appetizers into the air, creating a momentary distraction, used a nearby drink tray as an improvised shield, somehow turned the assassin's own ceremonial robe into an impromptu straitjacket, and, most confusingly, managed to save both the Emperor and the plate of appetizers from hitting the floor. The entire incident took less than 2 seconds. The assassin was contained, the Emperor was safe, and the human was already making a joke about how these parties always end up being a real killer. The court was horrified, not by the assassination attempt, those were practically a cultural tradition at this point, but by the complete disregard for proper security procedures. The manual clearly stated that any assassination attempt should be met with a minimum of 3 different types of energy weapons, followed by the immediate activation of the quantum containment field. Instead, they had witnessed something that defied all logical analysis. The security experts would later spend months trying to understand how the human had known to act before any detectable threat had manifested. The human's explanation didn't help. Something felt off about the way they were walking. You know, when you can just tell someone's up to no good? Like that. This led to an entire subdivision of the Imperial Security Force attempting to quantify and replicate the human concept of something feeling off. Their preliminary report spanning 2,000 pages, concluded that humans possess some form of probability manipulation field that operates, but the incident itself was only the beginning. The investigation that followed would reveal something even more disturbing about why humans made such effective bodyguards and why the court had every reason to be terrified. The cleanup operation was already underway, with various specialized teams following their precisely designated protocols for post-assassination attempt procedures. The human, breaking yet another rule, was helping the cleaning staff pick up scattered appetizers while simultaneously maintaining a security perimeter and explaining to a group of shocked diplomats why Earth beings called it a cocktail party. The chief of Imperial Security, their tentacles twisted into the official knot of extreme consternation, approached the human with a data pad containing exactly 347 questions about their unprecedented response time, how they began their universal translator, struggling to convey both professional curiosity and existential dread. Did you anticipate the attack? Our most advanced predictive algorithms showed no indication of hostile intent. The human shrugged, a gesture that the court had come to recognize as a prelude to an explanation that would give them all headaches. They were wearing their ceremonial robes wrong. Wrong? The chief's optical sensors rapidly recalibrated. The robes followed all official specifications for diplomatic attire. Yeah, but they were adjusted to allow for a wider range of arm movement. Nobody does that unless they're planning to reach for something. Plus, their walking rhythm was off too. Too much weight on their back legs, like they were ready to spring forward. The court members within earshot began frantically taking notes. This was precisely the kind of information that should be impossible for anyone to notice, let alone use as the basis for split-second defensive actions. But why? Asked the Assistant Deputy Sub-Coordinator of Threat Assessment. Didn't you follow standard containment procedures? The human was now helping a server restack glasses into a pyramid, because apparently they could maintain perfect situational awareness while engaging in completely irrelevant tasks. Standard procedures are predictable. If I did what they expected, they would have had a counterplan. So I did something they wouldn't expect. Nobody plans for getting taken down by their own fancy robe. This statement sent ripples of horror through the court. The idea that security procedures should be unpredictable was antithetical to everything they believed in. Security was supposed to be about establishing and following perfect protocols, not improvising based on fashion observations. The investigation continued for weeks. Teams of analysts reviewed every microsecond of the incident. They created detailed models of human reaction times, conducted studies on the aerodynamics of thrown appetizers, and even attempted to quantify the tactical advantages of what the human called dad joke diplomacy. But it was during the interrogation of the would-be assassin that the most disturbing revelation came to light. The Proximans, still slightly dazed from their encounter with their own ceremonial garment, provided an insight that would change the court's understanding of human security methods forever. We had planned for everything, they admitted, every possible security response, every technological countermeasure, every standard protocol. But how do you plan for someone who doesn't follow any plan? How do you predict the actions of a species that treats careful planning as merely a suggestion? They're chaos incarnate. The court reviewed the assassin's own carefully constructed plan. It was beautiful in its complexity, accounting for every standard security measure with backup plans for the backup plans. It would have worked perfectly against any normal security force, but it had failed because humans, as a species, were fundamentally immune to the very concept of predictability. Their strength as bodyguards wasn't in their physical capabilities or their advanced technology. It was in their inherent ability to be precisely the wrong kind of threat at precisely the right time. The Emperor, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire incident, seemed almost amused by their court's ongoing existential crisis. When asked why they had chosen a human as their sole bodyguard, they simply gestured to the security footage playing on a nearby screen. In it, the human could be seen simultaneously subduing the assassin, protecting the emperor, preventing a diplomatic incident with the Arapodian ambassador who had almost been hit by a flying appetizer, and somehow managing to tell a joke that made even the assassin groan. Because, the emperor said, their voice carrying the weight of someone who had discovered a fundamental truth about the universe, sometimes the best defense is being completely incomprehensible to your enemies. The court had to admit, albeit very reluctantly, and only in sealed documents that would never see the light of day, that perhaps the human's methods had some merit after all. It's rather difficult to assassinate someone when their bodyguard's actions don't follow any logical pattern that can be predicted or countered. They still filed their complaints, of course. There were forms for that sort of thing, and filling out forms was one of the few constants left in their increasingly chaotic universe. But they did so with the growing realization that perhaps chaos, when properly channeled through a human bodyguard, was its own form of order. The human, meanwhile, had already moved on to implementing new security measures that made absolutely no sense to anyone, but somehow worked perfectly. They called it tactical whimsy, and the mere concept gave the chief of protocol a migraine that lasted for 3 standard solar cycles. And so, the Galactic Court learned to live with their new reality, where the highest level of security was maintained by a being whose species treated the laws of probability as polite suggestions and combat manuals as interesting fiction. They didn't have to like it, but they had to admit it worked, even if it meant watching their human bodyguard turn the sacred halls of power into what they called a casual Friday every single day of the week. The aftermath of the Harmony Ball incident sparked what could only be described as an existential crisis among the galaxy's most elite security forces. Picture, if you will, a room full of the most advanced tactical minds in 17 sectors, all trying to understand how their centuries of combined experience had been outperformed by what the human called watching too many action movies as a kid. The investigation was launched with all the pomp and circumstance that 19 different bureaucratic systems could muster. The committee appointed to study the human's methods included experts in xenopsychology, quantum probability, and one particularly confused expert in interpretive dance, who had been invited by mistake but stayed because the coffee was good. Their first breakthrough came when they discovered the human's pre-employment screening process, buried under 17 layers of classified documents and 1 coffee stain. The records revealed a selection procedure that could only be described as unconventional, a word that made most court officials develop a nervous tic. The testing had begun normally enough. The candidates were subjected to the standard battery of physical examinations, psychological evaluations, and tactical assessments. The human had scored adequately, not exceptionally, just adequately. This should have eliminated them from consideration immediately. Adequate was a word that had no place in imperial security. But then came the unstructured portions of the testing. During the tactical simulation, while other candidates deployed cutting-edge combat techniques, the human had solved the scenario by convincing the simulated assassin to attend therapy. When questioned about this approach, they had simply said, "Well, happy people generally don't try to murder emperors." The combat assessment had been equally baffling. Instead of engaging the combat drones in direct confrontation, the human had reprogrammed them to perform what they called it synchronized dancing. The evaluation team was still trying to figure out how this had happened, as the drones weren't supposed to be programmable, but it was the final test that truly revealed why humans were simultaneously the best and most terrifying choice for imperial security. The scenario was simple. Protect a high-value target in a crowded space with minimal resources. While other candidates requested additional weapons or security systems, the human asked for a deck of playing cards, 3 rubber bands, a small potted plant, and permission to reorganize the palace's breakroom schedule. What followed was a masterclass in what the human termed social engineering, but what the court's observers described as weaponized chaos theory. Within 6 hours, they had created an informal intelligence network using maintenance staff's gossip, established 3 different false rumours about security protocols, set up a card game that somehow involved every potential threat in the room, and used the potted plant as both a surveillance blind and an impromptu weapon. The evaluation team's report struggled to quantify exactly how effective this approach was, primarily because their monitoring systems kept getting distracted by the card game. The final note simply read, "Subject appears to have turned the entire security scenario into a party, while simultaneously neutralizing all threats. We are unsure how this is possible." But the real revelation came during the mandatory post-scenario interview. When asked about their unconventional methods, the human explained their philosophy of security in terms that would later require 3 different xenopsychologists to decode. Look, everyone expects security to be all serious and rigid, right? That's exactly why it fails. The best security is the one nobody notices, because they're too busy having a good time to realize they're being watched. Plus, it's way harder to stab someone when you're laughing at their jokes. This led to the creation of an entirely new field of study, Human Tactical Unpredictability Theory, or HUT for short. The preliminary findings were disturbing. Traditional security relied on patterns, protocols, and predictability. The theory was that by establishing perfect procedures, any deviation could be immediately identified and neutralized. It was logical, systematic, and completely useless against anyone who had studied those procedures, as it seemed to operate on an entirely different principle. They treated security as an improvisational art form, adapting and evolving their methods so rapidly that it was impossible to develop countermeasures. Their greatest strength wasn't in their ability to follow procedures, but in their ability to discard them entirely when something better occurred to them. The court's analysts discovered, to their horror, that this approach was fundamentally superior to traditional methods for one simple reason: you cannot plan against chaos. Every attempt to develop a strategy against human security measures failed because the humans would simply do something completely different the next time. This revelation led to several attempts to replicate human security methods. The results were mixed. The Arxian Guard tried to implement tactical whimsy and ended up creating a security protocol so random that even they couldn't follow it. 3 officers got lost in their own security maze and were found 2 days later playing card games with the maintenance staff. The Centurion Defense Force attempted to incorporate human intuition into their training. They spent 6 months trying to quantify the concept of bad vibes before giving up and returning to their traditional methods, though several members continued to insist that they could now sense sketchy behaviour. The Proximate Security Directory tried to create an algorithm that would replicate human unpredictability. The AI they developed became so unpredictable that it decided to become a performance artist instead of a security system. But perhaps the most telling evidence came from the criminal underworld. Reports began surfacing of potential assassins and criminals explicitly avoiding any operation where a human was involved in security. As one captured conspirator put it, "How do you plan against someone who might stop you with advanced combat techniques or might just challenge you to a dance-off? It's not worth the headache." The human's personal security logs only added to the court's confusion. Instead of detailed threat assessments and response protocols, they contained entries like, Tuesday. Notice the ambassador from Proxima 7 was wearing their ceremonial dagger on the wrong hip. Turned out they had a back injury. Recommended a good chiropractor. Potential crisis averted through medical referral. Thursday. Implemented new security measure. Weekly poetry slam in the guard break room. Morale improved 300%. Also caught 3 surveillance devices hidden in the refreshment table because nobody expects security to rhyme. Saturday. Taught the Emperor's personal chef how to make earth tacos. Now have entire kitchen staff as informal intelligence network. Also, significantly improved palace menu. The court's attempts to formalize these methods into proper protocols were exercises in futility. Every time they thought they had grasped the underlying principle, the human would do something completely different that somehow worked even better. The final report, spanning thousands of pages and numerous appendices, could be summarized in one sentence. Human security methods are effective precisely because they cannot be effectively documented, replicated, or predicted. This conclusion sent shockwaves through the galactic security community. Everything they knew about protection protocols, everything they had refined over millennia of service, was being upended by a species that treated formal training as helpful suggestions and combat manuals as interesting bedtime reading. The humans' response to seeing this report was to laugh and add it to what they called their collection of overthinking things. They then proceeded to reorganize the entire palace security system based on what they claimed was inspiration from a children's game called Tag. It worked perfectly, of course. The court eventually had to accept a truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge. The most effective security system in the galaxy was a human making it up as they went along. Their most classified documents now included a new protocol for dealing with human security personnel. Step 1. Do not attempt to understand their methods. Step 2. Do not attempt to predict their actions. Step 3. Do not attempt to replicate their results. Step 4. Accept that chaos is now your standard operating procedure. And somewhere in the palace, a human bodyguard continued their duties, blissfully unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware, that their very existence had revolutionized galactic security theory. They were probably telling jokes to the maintenance staff while simultaneously monitoring 17 different potential threats and planning next week's interplanetary poker tournament surveillance operation. The galaxy had never been safer, even if no one could explain exactly why. In the 2 years following the Harmony Ball incident, the Galactic Court's relationship with their human security paradigm evolved from outright horror to a sort of resigned appreciation, like watching a particularly skilled demolitions expert juggle anti-atter. You might not approve of the method, but you can't argue with the results. The most fascinating development wasn't the complete absence of successful assassination attempts, but rather how potential threats simply stopped trying. The human had somehow managed to create what they called passive deterrence, which primarily consisted of being so unpredictable that planning any sort of attack became an exercise in futility. Consider the following incident report, recovered from a failed conspiracy target analysis. Imperial Security, Human Threat Level. Abandoned Mission Notes. Subject appears to simultaneously be everywhere and nowhere. Has transformed palace security into an elaborate game of social chess. Have observed subject thwarting assassination attempts while conducting cooking classes, organizing interspecies poetry competitions, and once while apparently sleeping. Cannot determine if subject is genius or insane. Possibly both. Recommendation: find easier target, preferably one guarded by predictable methods. The court's attempt to understand this phenomenon led to several breakthrough realizations about human nature, each more disturbing than the last. Humans didn't just think outside the box, they questioned why the box existed in the first place, then repurposed it as something entirely different. Their apparent randomness was actually a highly sophisticated form of pattern recognition that operated on levels most species couldn't comprehend. They treated every social interaction as both a potential threat and an opportunity to make friends, often simultaneously. The Emperor, displaying the insight that had kept them alive through 17 different succession crises, summarized it perfectly. The greatest security isn't in having the strongest walls, but in making everyone want to keep you alive. This philosophy manifested in bizarre but effective ways. The human had transformed the palace's traditional security barriers into community spaces. Guards didn't just stand at their posts, they participated in weekly social events. Even the most hardened assassins found it difficult to maintain murderous intent when invited to join a book club or weekly cooking class. The court's final attempt to quantify human security methods produced a report that read more like existential poetry than a tactical analysis. Human security operates on the principle that the best defense is being simultaneously the most dangerous and most approachable being in any room. They create an environment where violence becomes socially awkward rather than tactically difficult. Their greatest weapon isn't their combat capability, but their ability to make potential threats feel included in a community. And perhaps that was the most terrifying revelation of all, that in a galaxy of advanced civilizations, complex security systems, and elaborate protocols, the most effective defense was a human who treated mortal danger as an opportunity to make new friends. The Emperor's Court still files their complaints, still maintains their protocols, and still tries to understand exactly how their human security officer manages to be everywhere and nowhere at once. But they do so with the comfortable knowledge that they are perhaps the safest beings in the galaxy, even if that safety comes at the cost of their sanity. Final report, Imperial Security Analysis. Conclusion: human security methods remain impossible to quantify, replicate, or predict. Recommendation: accept that this is precisely why they work. Additional note: suggest implementing mandatory stress leave for analysts attempting to understand human methodology. And somewhere in the palace, a human bodyguard continues their duties, protecting the galaxy's most important being through a combination of combat skills, social engineering, and what they insist on calling the power of friendship, much to the continued bafflement of everyone else. After all, in a universe of infinite possibilities, perhaps the most logical security system is one that defies logic entirely, even if it gives the court's protocol department collective anxiety every single day. And they wouldn't have it any other way.